Carlos.
Oh, yes. It's already here. Good. Thank you.
Well,
Good evening. I know, thank
so
you.
much for telling conductor jokes. Here he is.
I know.
Okay,
we were
okay,
hoping
go
for
ahead.
A few minutes.
I know a couple of them.
I'm sure you do. You probably inspired a few.
Where do you want to sit?
I'll sit on this end. Would you mind to take the middle?
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome to the Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall and a very unusual and wondrous program. I'm Robert McBride of All Classical Portland. This is Carlos Kalmar, music director of the Oregon Symphony.
Good evening.
This is Michael Curry, the Michael Curry of Lion King fame and Katy Perry at the Super Bowl on a big lion and all kinds of other things, including this set, which is all about Persephone tonight, an amazing piece by Igor Stravinsky. I fell in love with Stravinsky when I was in high school, and The Firebird came my way and blew my mind, and he's been one of my favorite composers ever since. I have a lot of Stravinsky recordings. I've read a lot of stuff about him. I thought I knew about Stravinsky. I didn't know about Persephone until, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago? What?
Well, there is an explanation for everything. So, when we all think about Igor Stravinsky as a composer, we are actually thinking about 3 pieces, all in all. Maybe some sidekicks that he also wrote, but essentially we are thinking Firebird, Rite of Spring, Petrushka, which are the big 3 ballets that he wrote, which are incredibly colorful, meaty, sometimes very aggressive, Rite of Spring, and all of them at some point in the piece blow up the place. At some point. I mean, the ending of Firebird, yeah, you want to have that, etc., etc., etc. But Stravinsky wrote a lot of other music, including Persephone, and Persephone is not like that. I would say even at all, unless you look into Stravinsky in terms of just the colorful side of him, meaning what does he do with colors in an orchestra? And second, if you look at him in terms of the lyrical part of him.
This piece is really lyrical.
Yeah,
long melodic lines.
Yeah, and truth to be said, because I think everybody should admit this, even people who are absolutely crazy about Stravinsky and say, oh my, are not sure whether this piece is the masterpiece that it actually is.
Oh, I think so.
Because the piece doesn't, it's not easy for all of you. The piece is kind of challenging because, yes, there are melodic lines, but the harmonies are a little bit strange. With maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, it lacks completely this punchy, bouncy, extremely fast, rhythmical Stravinsky. And on top of everything, you know, in so many pre-concert talks that we too have done, we come to some point where we say, and why is this piece not more famous? And one of my kind of lines that I always say is, well, the ending is weird. The ending is weird. Because in Persephone, there is, harmonically speaking, there is not this like, now I let it go. In terms of the history itself, where we are in the story, there is no like, okay, it's over. There is, in a way, to be continued.
It's a sequel. It's Groundhog Day. She begins again.
Yeah.
It's a groundhog story. So all of that together makes...
As Bill Murray famously said in the movie, you see Groundhog Day? Never mind. So, Michael Curry, how long have you been a Stravinsky fan?
Well, I've done all the oddball Stravinsky pieces since 1991. We did Oedipus Rex in Tokyo, Japan, and then again with Robert Lapaz, Le Rossignol, The Nightingale, and other small fables we did at Brooklyn Academy of Music. They're very quirky pieces, short pieces that they often are curated together. But this piece, I loved it because of the mythical story, and as Carlos says, the color of it was so good for a visualist. There are real locations described in both, of course, the libretto. André Gide's libretto is very clear about this, but then Stravinsky's music, less clear. And Carlos will probably talk about the relationship between the librettist and the composer was not a happy place. So the piece has its challenges within itself. It has conflict. And then visually trying to glue that together with the music so I can help tell the musical story as well. But it's been a really great challenge. Stravinsky is wonderful, as all composers are. As a visual designer, you hear the music and hopefully you get some sense of color and signals, you know, about what it is. And Stravinsky does that really well. I mean, he seems to, it's this hash, this mix-up that's very interesting about the changes. And even our choir they have a hard time hanging their hat on anything consistent. So it's a very changeable, malleable piece. I guess much like the seasons and the weather itself.
Yeah, especially today. You talked about the rite of spring. This piece is about spring and winter and why the seasons happen. It's the Greek myth of how those seasonal cycles came to be.
Actually, question two, do you know what this Greek myth, do you actually know the Greek myth of how spring, yes?
I will by the end of the night.
Okay. Do you want to tell the story in a nutshell?
Sure, I can. It's been interesting how many people say, yeah, I know Persephone, but then they really don't know the story because it's been used so in popular culture, and Demeter, the mother of Persephone, is the goddess of agriculture. Persephone, her daughter, is now the symbol of spring because she was abducted and taken to Hades by Pluto and kept in the underworld, where she refused everything from the underworld except the pomegranate reminded her of the sun from her previous life, and she ate 4 seeds of the pomegranate. That's why we have 4 months of winter. But then finally she was allowed by the gods to go back, rejoin her mother, but she, once experiencing the underworld, felt sympathy in Gide's story, sympathy for the underworld, and voluntarily returns every winter, and tells the world the seed must die to grow again. And this is a very archetypal story. Agricultural myths are found in every culture. This is the Greek version. This is the one that's been most adapted and maligned, and as you know, in the Greek gods, the interchanging of names. So it's very confusing, but it would be interesting for you. We have supertitles, so those of you that don't know the story will follow it, but there's probably be a lot of you during the break that will get on Wikipedia and sort of study that a little bit.
There's a wonderful sentence in your program notes, too, which you should try to read tonight because they're very helpful in understanding this piece. So it has narration, as a narrator, all in French, and it has a tenor soloist, and it has the choir, and the kids' choir, and the orchestra.
I
got to get this sentence out, and then you can correct me. And so people were confused by it. What is this thing? Is it an opera? Is it an oratorio? What is it? And the sentence that I like so much in your program notes talks about the premiere, and it says, critical assessment ran the gamut, but confusion was a consistent theme.
Well, I just jumped at the occasion of saying there is no narrator, there is an actress. So a narrator actually stands somewhere with a microphone or not and says, "And now," or "Once upon a time." To some extent, interesting enough, the "Once upon a time" guy exists, but he sings. So, this is a piece for mixed chorus, which is probably something like the idea of the Greek chorus, like it always have been in the theater. Children's chorus, Act 3. A singer, a Molpus, kind of a high priest persona, that is actually the narrator, who kind of always interferes and says, and this is what happened, and in the old Greek, sort of. Sometimes he's also more involved into what happens in the moment. And then there is Persephone. And Persephone is an actress, and she speaks in French.
And she's a dancer.
That's the other Persephone. But that's something that actually, I love it when Michael kind of talks about the fact that in the piece, as written by Gide and Stravinsky, Persephone appears twice. It's kind of a dualism. She's the actress who speaks, and she's also the dancer who dances. And then comes Michael Carey.
Well, I felt that already they're insinuating two characters, the narrator and the dancer, calling it a ballet. And this piece has been done traditionally with this very static ballet, very almost Greek poses like vase paintings. I was interested in the duality. Her life is so split anyway, given the above and the below world. She lives the winter and spring, that I wanted to expand on the notion of the split, the dichotomy, the balance, the duality of this character. So we've not only included the narrator, the dancer, I also have a version of Persephone that is a puppet, which is probably the biggest metaphor I can make for the manipulation of this girl and her sheer control by the gods. So you will see an evolution from synthetic to human and back. And I've taken the liberties of making the Persephone that lives in the real world, the above world, be a synthetic, be a puppet. But when she goes to the underworld, she finds her human self, the dancer. So, but I trick you several times into these relationships because my puppet and my dancer are computer scanned and made as the same piece. So they're identical. We started with the dancer, scanned her, and then sculpted a recreation of her that is a puppet. But it sounds high-tech, but we have 3 master puppeteers who are bunraku. They're black characters. You'll see a lot of black Greek statues running around doing things on stage. Don't look at them.
I'm curious, Michael, you are an artist. You are a very famous puppeteer and designer, and you're a storyteller. How important has mythology been to you in your life? Did you, when you were little, relate to these stories or come to them later?
No, mythology was a function of, that was what people did in theater, and there's a reason for that. And there are common themes that cross the board. It's likely that a myth will attract a broad viewership, and people will understand the baseline. The fun thing that artists do is they take myths, what you thought you knew about a myth, and then they expand on it and make it a new myth, maybe relevant to today. You see this all the time where people are taking modern versions of Shakespeare or a myth is taken and made pertinent for today. I think that more than anything, there's a familiarity to them because myths are tried and tested evidence of trends in humanity. Myths often predate the recording of man, so it's a way to sort of set it in stone, and it's how, when verbal education happened, myths were super important, like songs were. This is really where the Greek chorus came from, where maybe music itself came from, as a way to extend information and communicate.
This guy is really interesting. We could spend all night talking to you. There was a panel discussion a couple of weeks ago about this project, which is available online. It's probably at the Oregon Symphony website.
I'm sure.
I went to that, and it was really interesting to hear all of you talk about all of these things, which most of us don't take the time to think about or have the time to think about.
Well, we actually have to spend, and we spend it gladly, the time to think about it. It's also that in this piece, because at the beginning I talked about the maybe reasons why a masterpiece like this is not more famous. I guess one of the other reasons is that when you play, usually this piece, if it's ever played, it's either a part of a ballet in an opera house, which is fine, but you can also do the concert version, which would mean you have an orchestra, you have on one side the tenor, a molpus, and on the other side the actress, the chorus behind, that's it. And it's kind of a piece of concert, that's it. Unfortunately, I believe that this piece doesn't really carry all the messages across if you don't have visuals. And it's not because I think visuals are just here to help. Visuals are actually an interpretation of what it is. And if you're interested, just for what it's worth, you are going to see one version, Michael's version, which I think simply blows your mind. It's that simple. And then you can go home and think a little bit and think, wait a second, maybe I can find another. And you go on YouTube and you find something that has literally nothing to do with what you're going to see tonight. Now, one thing that has to be mentioned, which might be of interest, we talked about the fact that this piece has many aspects and you cannot pinpoint. It's not a ballet, it's not an oratorio, it's certainly not an opera. It's kind of a melodrama because of the spoken words. But one very interesting aspect in terms of the creation of this piece is the relationship between the librettist and the composer. So I would say in a nutshell, the way it works in normality is there is the composer chooses the librettist, and the librettist does what the composer wants. Not in this case. In this case, actually, the librettist, André Gide, one of the greatest poets of France, later won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think it was 1947. And first, in terms of how did this evolve, first was the poem. Then came Ira Rubinstein, who has more money than God, and and kind of said, oh, let's do this. And Stravinsky was very interested, and Gide was, oh, cool. He adapted the libretto. And he did something that is very unusual. He essentially told Stravinsky, I want this to sound like this. And here where I have this line of poetry, I want this color in the music. Stravinsky, being Stravinsky, he couldn't care less. He ignored it to an extent that is actually an abomination. Because matter of fact, when you write lyrics in music, one rule, at least I would say an ancient classical rule, is follow the rhythm of the lyrics. In words, if I say follow the rhythm of the lyrics, I wouldn't say follow the rhythm of the lyrics.
But Stravinsky might.
But that's what Stravinsky writes wonderful music and the words fall where they fall. That's it. And Gide was not happy.
Gide didn't even go to the premiere. He just left town, didn't care. Crazy. I would have been there. So you may not know that Michael Curry is from Grants Pass, went to school here, he's an artist, then went to New York and was an artist. I want to know what your paintings were like then. And were you a sculptor as well? You must have been.
Yeah, I was a sculptor and painter in New York, and I got into theater by doing sculptures that moved in galleries, and without knowing it, I was doing theatrical pieces. And it was theater people who saw my work early in New York and said, this work belongs on stage. And many of them, Julie Taymor and these people, were at that time really bringing visual theater to the stage. I should say that it was also in the 70s and 80s when Star Wars, the movie, came out, and people wanted more layers and special effects on stage. And I knew how to do it because we grew up here in Oregon building our own houses, and I just was so popular among my friends because I could fix toilets and make things that I extended that sort of craftiness to developing new ways to do theater. And I became especially, I've always liked motion, being a hyperactive kid from Grants Pass. I like motion. If something moves, I like it. And so puppetry was my form of sculpture. It was simply that. I was a good sculptor, yeah, you make it, there it is. Ooh, you walk around it, that's all the movement you get. But when you make it move, it goes into a fourth dimension. So, which is also interesting, because puppetry commands people to watch it. There's a contrivance there that interests people, not just children. I think The Lion King proved that. We could tell a very sort of, in a way, a mythical story with a way that conveyed the sense of animals, but done in a sculptural way that was pleasing with movement, and it makes you watch. And so I don't use puppetry because I love it tremendously. I use it alternately with humanity. But you'll see maybe tonight poignant images that we want you to really burn a hole right into your psyche. We use puppetry a lot for that symbol. And plus, you can do things with it you can't do to a human. So,
This is a rare situation where you and your team are working right here,
Yes.
where you live. You're
Yes.
usually somewhere else, anywhere around the planet. So, would you do a show of your art here in a gallery? Could we see what your static work looks like, your old work?
Yeah.
I want to see what you're doing
I
in New
do.
York.
I do. I still crank out a lot of paintings, and this is what I do for a hobby. I watercolor the beauty of Oregon. But I do want to say my team, we have 50 artists in Scappoose, Oregon, and they've been with me for all of them over 10 years on average. And they, about 10 of us go to shows around the world, and we do the thing of directing, and and then the 40 that stay in design and manufacture often don't go to those shows. So I've been looking for a Portland area collaboration, and with Carlos, it was such an honor to be asked. What's really great about it, the puppeteers you're seeing up there, most of them are builders in my fabrication or designers, and some of them are computer artists, and they're the ninjas in this show, and they're all very good. You can't work with my stuff for very many years without learning your way around it. But we're especially proud to be working in the Portland area with the best artistic institution that exists in the Pacific Northwest, this symphony. I'm going to let you talk about music. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Curry.
I
Genius.
can only tell you that I'm afraid that Michael. Do you have open houses at your studio in Scappoose?
Yes.
What about Halloween parties?
We're done by then.
Man, a Halloween sleepover at his place?
If you ever, probably you can find open houses at his web page, probably michaelcurry.com, I guess. Highly recommendable for me, because I have been not only conducting my entire life, I have been in opera, and opera is very interesting because of what is being created for a stage, and it's very visual. But the first time I came to Michael's studio, it was like, oh Lord, wow, this is just. It's also because, first of all, it's puppetry. It's not the theater I know, and second, because you step right into modern times, meaning all this creation that now you can do on computers. I could even tell you some of the things. No, I'm not going to say a word about what you're seeing.
But you will see some things that you haven't seen before. At least I was at the rehearsal today, and I saw things I hadn't seen before. It's pretty amazing. There is another piece on the program.
Really?
Yeah, it actually starts with a Tchaikovsky symphony. And the comment about seeing things and just burning them into your eye reminded me of a wonderful comment by Stravinsky, because he grew up in St. Petersburg, and when he was a little boy, he was at the opera one day with his mother, and in an intermission, she said, "Look, Igor, there's Tchaikovsky." And the little boy turned and saw his hero, magnificent Russian composer, and he later said that image was, I think his words were, burned on the retina of my memory. And I love that. That's so vivid. He loved Tchaikovsky and refashioned some of Tchaikovsky's music in one of his pieces called The Fairy's Kiss.
Recent. Yeah, Fairy's Kiss. We did that fairly recently. A brilliant piece of music.
So to pair this Tchaikovsky symphony, his second, with Persephone is perfect. And it's so charming. He uses
in a way,
melodies.
the way I think is you have to pair Persephone with something that is quite melodical and which is not demeaning at all. I adore this symphony, most of it. Something that is kind of folk-tuney and lighter in character.
I heard a lot of music today, including the end of the Met broadcast of Rosenkavalier and all of your rehearsal today and all of Persephone. And the thing that's been stuck in my head all day is the second movement of the Tchaikovsky symphony, which was originally a wedding march in an opera. And it's so charming. It's wonderful.
Well, the thing is, so Symphony No. 2 by Tchaikovsky is called the Little Russian. Little Russian is a slightly demeaning term from the 19th century for Ukrainians. So essentially the correct title for the symphony, if Tchaikovsky would have cared for it, would be Ukrainian symphony. Not Little Russian, because you think Little Russian, so what? Anyway, the title Little Russian is not by Tchaikovsky, it's by a music critic who heard the symphony. And the reason why it is actually correct to say this symphony is somewhat Ukrainian is that 3 out of 4 movements quote Ukrainian folk songs, literally, note by note. You can go on YouTube and say, down the mother Volga, which is the first one, and there you hear it, and you think, oh, that's the first movement, and etc., etc. Only the third movement doesn't quote anything. It's just, but it still has this quality of folk tune. I tell you that I always try always to tell the truth. So I actually love this symphony very much, but in a way, the last movement, which I'm sure you will just love and adore, it gets a little bit silly. So, because it's kind of it has an introduction and then comes a fast-paced theme, which is a folk song from Ukraine, and then it repeats it, and then he repeats it, and 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 he repeats it.
And that's the revised version.
Yeah, in the first version it was way longer. I mean, the thing is, so in a way, it's a set of variations. But it's not, because variations mean you're going to tweak things one way or the other. And actually, Tchaikovsky, what he does is he changes harmonies on occasion, and he changes a lot of instrumentation. And what happens is that the last movement, it's thoroughly, brilliantly amusing, but it's with all my, I am one of the Tchaikovsky fanatics, but it's a piece that I imagine myself being on tour with an orchestra and having 20 concerts in a row, all with Tchaikovsky second. After the 10th time, I think I will have to drink a little bit of vodka before the last movement, because it's just, having said that, the simplicity, in a way, of the second movement, this kind of wedding march, is astonishing. It's so simple, and it's just genius. You cannot help yourself but smile through it.
All in all, a really unusual, interesting, beautiful concert. Really glad you're here. I'm Robert McBride. He's Carlos Colmore. You're the audience. Maybe the most important part of all.
Thank you, Robert.